Water sharing in the Murray-Darling Basin's Border Rivers catchment. The Border Rivers Area is one of the northernmost catchments in the Murray-Darling Basin and is situated across the New South Wales and Queensland border, covering both states in roughly equal parts. It constitutes around 4% of the Murray-Darling Basin land area, but only around 2.5% of the population. This catchment is the largest contributor of flow to the Barwon-Darling, producing around 35% of the long-term flow in the river at Menindee. Regulated and unregulated flows from the border rivers fluctuate significantly between wet and dry years and indicate the wide variability in flow levels across the valley and between seasons, due to summer being the predominant season for rainfall and irrigation use. Most water in the catchment is used for agricultural and irrigation purposes, with over 90% of the water used for irrigation diverted from surface water resources. Around 34% of overall available surface water is diverted for use. This is comparatively high compared to other catchments within the Murray-Darling Basin and thus reduces end-of-system flows and ultimately the reliability of water supply in the region. In addition to held environmental water, environmental surface water delivered under plan provisions is estimated to be around 26 gigalitres. The border rivers, New South Wales and Queensland manage the complex water sharing infrastructure and operational arrangements via the Damaresque-Barwon Border Rivers Commission, which was established via an intergovernmental agreement and ratified in legislation in both states. In New South Wales, the primary mechanism for defining water sharing arrangements is via water sharing plans, which are a statutory requirement under the New South Wales Water Management Act 2000. These water sharing plans form a large part of the water resource plans, which are required to be prepared under the Australian Government's Water Act 2007 and Basin Plan 2012. To align with the Basin Plan, recent New South Wales legislation has separated the unregulated and alluvial water sharing plans. Given the heavy dependence on surface waters in the Border Rivers region, in this presentation I will be focusing on surface waters, and in particular on the regulated river sources. However, the connectivity between surface water and groundwater cannot be ignored, and any changes to surface water allocations will likely affect groundwater resources and vice versa. Within state and interstate surface water trade is allowed between New South Wales and Queensland. But the Queensland portion of this region will not be covered in this presentation, as they use other mechanisms for the allocation of water. Rural and semi-rural communities dominate this region, with agriculture, forestry and fishing being the main employment sector. In 2019, councils across New South Wales carried out population projections for the year 2016 to 2041. In Inverell, located in the Northern Tablelands and the Border Rivers' largest population centre, where primary industries are the predominant employment, populations, including those of working age, were estimated to remain stable. In Glen Innes, populations were predicted to decrease, due largely to people moving to larger regional centres. In Tenterfield, decreases in population were also expected due to families continuing to leave the town and an ageing population. It is interesting to note that support of infrastructure and capital works programs, including improving water security for the Tenterfield Shire with the delivery of a $4 million extended groundwater supply, are hoped to improve these population figures. Despite the population figures, expected growth in irrigated agriculture in the region should see an increased demand for water. However, a changing climate, which includes decreasing rainfall and runoff and increased temperatures and evapotranspiration, will see mean inflows to the catchment reduced by an estimated 14% and water availability reduced by at least 10% in the border rivers, under the best 2030 climate change estimate. In response to the increased scarcity of water, the CSIRO Sustainable Yields Project has predicted an expected additional 12 gigalitres a year of groundwater extraction from the Border Rivers Alluvial Groundwater Management Unit, which supplies around 1/3 of the groundwater use in the region. Alluvial sources are more sensitive to variation in rainfall and stream flows than other groundwater sources, and any groundwater extraction will ultimately affect the river flow. In the dry year of 2018-19, New South Wales users accessed the highest level of groundwater from the BRA, which was 58% of groundwater entitlements. Prolonged extractions at these levels is unsustainable and will lead to reductions in groundwater levels. Other predictions include a 27 times increase in the use of groundwater from the New England Fold Groundwater Management Unit and a 6 times increase in groundwater use in the rest of New South Wales. This increased groundwater use will reduce surface water availability by around 45% in the region and further accelerate the transition of the Damaresque River to a losing rather than a gaining stream. The assessment and allocation of water available in the regulated rivers follows a continuous accounting system. This system establishes water accounts for each licence held in the water source. These accounts are credited with a water allocation at the commencement of and during the water year, and debited as water is ordered and delivered for irrigation and other purposes. The total quantum of water that is available each water year for allocation to water accounts is the available water determination, which is measured as a percentage of a category of licence. In order to prevent over-allocation of water sources, the New South Wales Border Rivers Water Sharing Plan contains rules around planned environmental water, which establishes extraction limits and allows for adjustments to allocations if limits are exceeded. Such flow-based restrictions can be useful and aim to preserve portions of flows to the environment. The long-term average annual extraction limit is the limit of water that can be taken from each source. Assessment of long-term extraction limits and the current long-term average annual extraction are carried out after the end of each water year using a hydrologic computer model. This assessment occurs using CAP baseline conditions, which are derived from the level of development as at 1993-94, which should theoretically limit surface water diversions to volumes that are consistent with 1993-94 development. For the border rivers, the IQQM computer model indicates a long-term average annual extraction volume of 399,400 megalitres to be shared between New South Wales and Queensland. If the extraction from the water source exceeds the long-term limit by 3% or more, there are provisions within the plan to reduce the available water for supplementary licences. Extraction exceedances may also lead to the reduction of maximum volumes for regulated river general use licences. This should allow for a margin of error in the modelling and help ensure the government can control the allocation of the resource to prevent overuse. However, in order to ensure reliability of allocations, provisions under the Water Management Act 2000 allow licence holders to claim compensation from the government if policy changes, including water sharing plan rules, result in allocations being reduced by more than 3%. This could present a reluctance within the government to change water sharing plans due to the fear that compensation measures would be triggered, thus resulting in potential disincentives to taking measures to ensure water conservation and the resulting significant future costs for the government in compensation as users increase and the resources become scarcer. Other mechanisms to ensure sufficient water is in the system include a minimum daily release from Pindara Dam of 10 megalitres to meet basic landholder rights and access licence extractions. The continuous low flow aims to provide connectivity for downstream pools. Other timed and volume-controlled releases from the dam must occur to meet basic landholder rights and access licence extractions. A stimulus flow of 4,000 megalitres is set aside at the start of the water year to be released at a timing, rate, volume and duration determined by the department. The stimulus flow mirrors a naturally occurring hydrograph, targets fish breeding and wet interconnected riparian areas. However, if the Pindari stimulus flow trigger is not met, the flow will not be delivered unless it can be negotiated under rules in the new water sharing plan. In the border rivers unregulated rivers, most licences are for irrigated agriculture, with around 6% of the total share of licences used for supply to town water, including for Glen Innes and Tenterfield. Water is also taken pursuant to a non-licensed basic landholder right for domestic and stock purposes. The water sharing plan estimates that these requirements are 6.23 megalitres per day. From September to March, no access licence holders are permitted to take uncontrolled stream flow that would result in a flow in the Barwon River at Mangindi of 100 megalitres a day or less. To further safeguard against overuse, water determinations are announced by the Minister and are allocated to licences via a priority system in the following order. Firstly, storage losses are kept topped up to provide a 12-month forward supply. Next, essential supplies are topped up to provide a 2-year forward supply. Third, general security is supplied with 30% of the volume set aside for transmission losses, and the remainder is distributed in proportion to individual licence entitlement, up to the limit of the storage accounts of licence holders. General Security A-class licence holders must have received an equivalent allocation of 1 megalitre per share before any water can be allocated to General Security B-class licence holders. Finally, after environmental and other supplies to other regulated river licences have been met, supplementary water is permitted. Long-term simulation modelling done by the New South Wales Government seems to indicate that the regulated New South Wales Border River is a reliable water source relative to the total shares granted in the water source. For example, in the years 2009 to 2016, Stock licences, domestic licences, general security A, high security and local water utility licence received a yearly water allocation equivalent to 100% or greater. And long-term trends indicate full allocations were granted to high security and general security A water users 100% and 95% of the time, whilst general security B users at the commencement of the water year received 67% of shares 50% of the water years. This has prompted some water user groups to view the water resources as chronically underused and thus has prompted calls for less conservative allocations and seeking of redress for underuse in the new water plan. However, this modelling does not adequately consider recent climate data, which includes significant and continuing droughts in New South Wales. For the water sharing plans, the latest drought of record, that is the period when inflows into the catchment are at their historical low, which therefore sets the benchmark for how much water can be sustainably drawn from the rivers in the repeat of such event. In the border rivers, this data is drawn only up until July 2009. So what does the recent climate data tell us? Rainfall for the combined 2017-2018 April to September period was the lowest on record for around 50% of New South Wales. Over the 24-month period, there was a large decline in water resources in the northern half of the Murray-Darling Basin. For the border rivers under drought conditions up to July 2019, inflows to the Pindari and Glenelyn dams and downstream tributaries were low 5 of the 6 latest years. In the last 2 years, inflows were extremely low, in fact only 50% of the previously observed 24-month minimum. By the 6th of November 2019, Pindari Dam was at 4% capacity and Glenelyn Dam was at 3% capacity. Capacities in 2017 were 100% and 75% respectively. Based on the end of October 2019 assessment for both the dams, there would be no general security supply from the 1st of July 2019 onwards and no high security supply other than for critical human needs with only minimum releases occurring. In November 2019, deliveries were deemed not viable from Glenelyn Dam. Delivery of minimum daily flow requirements continued from Pindari Dam, however these only maintained flows to Ashford. In December 2019, dam releases were made to Boogabillar Weir for Boogabillar and Goondiwindi town water supplies, but were not sufficient to reach Mungindi. By 2020, the total commitment of water was higher than the available resources, with a shortfall of around 31,000 megalitres. Target flow volumes at Menindee Lakes and continuous flows in the Lower Darling River had not been provided since December 2018, and temporary weir pools which provided a refuge for high priority needs in the Lower Darling were drying up. These exceptional circumstances saw the New South Wales Government introduce temporary water restrictions or embargoes made under Section 324 of the Water Management Act 2000 from January to March 2020, which effectively suspended the rights to take water according to the water sharing plans. This was done to protect the first critical inflows, provide water for critical human needs, and to protect and restore water for the environment. Heavy rains in mid-January 2020 and the resultant substantial inflows, known as the 2020 Northern Basin First Flush event, saw water supply and town weir pools filled, including Mungindi, and dam levels at Pindari and Glenelyn recovered somewhat to 17% and 15% respectively, and the system reconnected to the Barwon River. Under the water sharing plan rules, 25% of these flows were protected from supplementary access and further protection was achieved under the Section 324 order. Menindee Lakes received 12 to 18 months of water supply and the Lower Darling was successfully restarted without significant fish deaths, blue-green algae outbreaks or salinity problems. Despite these positive outcomes, many water users in affected communities raised concerns and criticisms on the government's management of the event, which perhaps exacerbated already elevated levels of frustration and disenchantment in the community. Criticisms from the community included the absence of clear triggers in abandoning and reinstating the water sharing plan arrangements, the overly conservative flow estimation model used, and the balance of upstream and downstream needs. And although an independent review found the flow forecasting model to be sound and appropriate, and an independent panel assessment found the decision-making to be understandable given the severity of the drought conditions and with efforts to be based on best available information, opportunities for improvement were identified. A lack of coordinated approach and communication with Queensland and the community, and a lack of consultation with the traditional owners and Indigenous communities were identified as shortcomings. Significant data gaps were also found, relating to flows entering New South Wales from Queensland, floodplain harvesting, extraction and flow data, unregulated extraction data, channel capacity, and allowances for water to move to downstream locations. With more severe and frequent droughts and a drying climate expected in the future, opportunities for improvement will need to be tackled for better informed decision making. And moving forward, if water sharing plans are going to be the legislative tool by which water is allocated and distributed, then they need to be adaptive and contain first flush management arrangements to ensure connectivity of water sources and protect critical water needs. Although some effective flow-based mechanisms exist in the Border Rivers water sharing plans, other adaptive measures, such as first flush, recent data and provisions for climate variability, should be provided for within the Water Management Act and the water sharing plans to increase transparency and certainty.